In this video, we're looking at a very important question, and that question is why is China so prosperous economically despite being a communist country? Now, over the last several decades, we've seen a lot of communist countries in Europe collapse economically, that is. They were once communist countries. They were towing the path of communism, and they have really turned around. Most of them, or all of them in Europe, have turned around. They are now Western countries, and they're pursuing Western economic principles and policies. But the question is, why did China not suffer the same fate? Why is China prosperous despite being a communist country? Now, we're going to answer that question by taking a look at some very important facts about the GDP of this country, because the GDP really gauges a country's economic performance over a period of time, usually a year. And the GDP tells us how a country is doing. It ranks countries amongst countries. It tells us the economic power and economic vitality of a country. So we begin from 2018, and I want to take a look at how the country has done in the last 5 years, so to speak, right? So in 2018, then, the GDP was $13.8 billion US dollars, $13.8 billion, and that represented a 12.8% increase from 2017. 12.8% increase. Now, this is very significant. Why is it? Because most countries just move marginally, maybe 1 or 2% increase. But China, 12.8% increase. This is very significant, and we're going to talk about it as we move on. In 2019, then, it went up not a lot, $14.2 billion, and that represented 2.7% increase from 2018. Right now, when we take a look at what's happening in 2019, that's just the prelude to the pandemic, and things were slowing down, and economic activities were not flourishing as much, right, etc., because the pandemic was setting in, and that could be an explanation for this significant decrease from 2018 to 2019. In 2020, then, there was a slight increase from $14.2 billion to $14.6 billion, right? And that represented 2.6% increase. That's a marginal increase, but nevertheless an increase from 2019. Then in 2021, there was a significant increase, right? $17.7 billion, and that represented 20%, right? 20.7% increase from 2020. Now, again, in 2020, 2019, 2020, these were the pandemic years, especially towards the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, and all of 2020, the pandemic years. And of course, you know, goods and services were not on the move, and the people were not traveling. There were lockdowns, countries closed their airspace and the borders and so forth. So economic activities came to a standstill, right? Understandably a standstill. And that could be responsible for this very slow, very marginal increase in 2019 and 2020. But in 2021, as the economic situation began to increase coming from the pandemic, well, we see a 20% increase, 20.7% increase, representing $17.7 billion in GDP. And this gives you a sense of how China is performing economically. It's a very strong country economically, very powerful, second largest economy in the world, competing with the United States, competing with the European Union and many countries around the world. And we'll take a look at some of the reasons for this, right? The world's manufacturing hub. China is the world's manufacturing hub. So we'll take a look at this, the manufacturing hub of the world, because a lot of outsourced goods, a lot of outsourced contracts are in China, a lot of manufacturing going on, investments going on, consumption going on, etc. And if you take a look at stores around you, most of the items are made in China, and they're made cheaply in China. And this is one of the reasons why the country is prosperous economically. It has a policy, economic policy of free market entrepreneurism, and that's the second point here, deliberate economic policy of entrepreneurism, encouraging entrepreneurism, companies all over the place, small companies, medium-sized companies, large companies, entrepreneurism, all flourishing in the Chinese economy. So China is a very interesting country. It has communist government, politically it's communist, economically it's capitalist. Economically it's very competitive. Economically it's not dominant. Unlike most communist countries, where the government controls all the economic apparatus, it controls the water, it controls the electricity, it controls the telephone, the post office, and most of the infrastructure are controlled by the government. Not so in China. China economically is a capitalist country. It is free market economy. Politically, it's a communist country. This is the primary reason why the country is prosperous economically and has not gone the way of other communist countries, right? So the manufacturing hub of the world, the factory of the world, everything pretty much is made in China. Every household has a product or two or more made in China. Take a look at your cell phone, take a look at your camera, take a look at your shirt that you're wearing, take a look at the jacket of your cell phone cover, take a look at your handbag, your wallet. You know, most things made in China because it's the manufacturing hub of the world. The factory of the world's factory as it is known. Deliberate economic policies of entrepreneurism, as I've said earlier, right? And it encourages creativity, innovation, ingenuity, economic ingenuity. It encourages startup businesses. It encourages young people to get into business, to start their own business, to be creative, and to be out there in the market doing things and so forth. That's why you see a lot of stores online, a lot of stores, brick and mortar stores, a lot of initiatives happening in that country. Deliberate economic policy assisting entrepreneurism and making sure it is supporting entrepreneurism so that the country can compete. So a lot of factors combine to make China economic power. One, deliberate policies of entrepreneurism, free market economy, ensuring that the economy is vital by infusing ideas, creativity, and encouraging Chinese to explore economically. And of course, the third point here, foreign policy of infrastructural development in developing countries. China is very involved around the world, especially in the global south, where it is involved in infrastructural development and involved in businesses and opening companies all over the place and establishing its presence in developing countries, etc. And that is impacting its economic power as well. And that is positively impacting its economic power because it is collaborating with these countries, in some cases, taking resources back to China and developing those resources and reselling those resources to the developing countries or other countries, etc. All of these contribute to China being an economic power. So despite being a communist country, since 1949, it has a very thriving economic policy of entrepreneurism, of capitalism, of market competition, of let demand determine prices, and encouraging young people to go into business and to explore and to be creative and so forth. This is why China is an economic power, despite being a communist country, because it's world manufacturing. A lot of outsourced contracts are in China, and again, we see the goods coming from China. Again, deliberate policy of entrepreneurism and foreign policy of infrastructural development around the world, adding to its economic prowess because it gets resources, gets money from other parts of the world, and all of those going to China for. So, for example, when a Chinese company gets a contract in a developing country, well, it uses its own resources. It brings its own workers from China. And pretty much all of the equipment, the personnel, and the managers and the engineers are all Chinese. And what does that mean? It means that the resources and the income they earn all go back to China. All are spent in China. All are repatriated to China. And that is another way that the country has established its economic presence and is profiting from that. This is why China is an economic power despite being a communist country.